Hello everyone, it's lecture 8 of course BE544. In the previous lecture, we have illustrated the meaning of classification using convolutional neural network or CNN in short, and we understood the different layers such as conv and max pooling layers, and dealt with the different steps in instruction in building a CNN architecture or a model. We have demonstrated that there is an input layer that accepts the inputs. There are a set of hidden layers that are cascaded that takes the input and perform feature extraction. And then there is a final output layer where the output is produced or reported. And the output can be binary classification or multi-class classification. Binary classification when we are going to classify between two classes or two categories. For example, tumor and non-tumor. And multi-class classification where we deal with a set of classes such as normal, benign, invasive, or in situ, similar to the classes with our dataset, which is the BACH dataset. For the binary classification, we are applying the sigmoid activation function at the output layer, while in the multi-class classification, we are applying SoftMax activation function. So what is the difference between them? In sigmoid activation function, it takes the output from the output layer, whether its value is high or low, and applies that function, which is called sigmoid, that restricts the boundaries of it to be limited between 0 and 1, which is here and here. And in binary classification, you need to define a specific threshold that says that region should be related to class 1 or class 2. So for example, if we took a threshold of 0.5, we can say, for example, any value that's lower than 0.5 will be non-tumor and higher than or equal 0.5 will be tumor. And this sigmoid function is used with binary classification. While in multi-class classification, there should be a probability for each class that says for class 1 there is a probability, if for class 2 there is another probability, and so on. How to do that? Simply, we are going to apply the SoftMax activation function that finds the exponential of each value in the prediction and then divides it by the summation of all exponentials, which can be a normalized exponential value. So we take 3.2, apply exponential to it, and then sum to all of the exponential in the output layer. So 3.2 will be converted to the value 0.775. By doing the softmax to all the values of the output function, the resultant probabilities or the output probabilities summation will be 1. So if you summed all of these numbers will be 1 because we are normalizing each exponential value here. To get the class or the category, we need to find the maximum probability. So in that case, the input is related to the highest probability, which should be Doug. And as mentioned in the previous lecture, our aim to minimize the loss function between the actual output and the predicted output, which in our case is the output probabilities. So we need to use the loss function. The most commonly used classification loss function is called cross-entropy. So cross-entropy is a widely used loss function in machine learning, particularly for classification problems. Cross-entropy measures the performance of a classification model whose output is a probability, and the probability is a value between 0 and 1. And our goal for any loss function is to minimize that value. So by minimizing that loss function, we indicate that model performance is getting better. So in binary classification, we are going to use binary cross-entropy, and in multi-class classification, we are going to use categorical cross-entropy or sparse categorical cross-entropy. Both of them share the same factors. In binary classification, there are only two classes. That's why you will find only two partitions in the equation, while in multi-class classification you will find only one part, and that summation here and here indicates that we need to loop over all of the instances in our dataset. So if you have 10 images, we need to loop on each of them and calculate the loss, and then apply averaging to get the average loss function among all of these instances. So simply, we need to multiply the output by the log of the prediction. So in binary cross-entropy, we are applying the output by the log of the corresponding probability. And the same here. What about that portion? Simply, in binary cross-entropy, we have only two classes, 1 or 0. So if the class is 1, this portion will be used and this portion will be ignored because 1 minus 1 will be 0. And if we are dealing with the other class, which is 0, this part will be ignored and this part will be taken. And inside the log for the classes with the class 1, the instances with the class 1, we will calculate only the log of it, while the classes of class 0, you will calculate the log of 1 minus it. And because we are dealing with probabilities in multiclass classification using the SoftMax function, we don't need to use these two parts. We're just applying the log of the probability of the output multiplied by the corresponding actual class. So in our example of the multiclass classification, our aim is that these probabilities are targeted to be similar to the actual output, which is here. So we need to compute the loss function between the predicted output and the actual output, aiming to minimize the differences between them. So we will use the multiclass or the categorical cross-entropy, which is the summation of the output multiplied by the log of the corresponding probability. So we will multiply 1 by the log of 0.775 plus 0 multiplied by the corresponding probability inside the log, and so on, and sum all of these numbers so we can get a loss value of approximately 0.36. So that loss function will be used then in the second iteration to update the weights of the model, and these weights with the instances will produce another output probabilities that will be also minimized until the last iteration or convergence. This is another example. This is the output, 3 classes, and these are the corresponding probabilities for each class. So the categorical cross-entropy loss in that case will be 1 multiplied by the log of 0.7, 0 multiplied by the log of 0.2, 0 multiplied by the log of 0.1. By calculating the summation of it, we will reach a loss function of 0.35. Again, that loss function will be used to update the weights, aiming to reduce the value of the next loss function and the upcoming one to reach values approximately 0. So in minimization cases, our aim to get a loss function of 0. This means that the differences between the predicted output and the actual output is 0. Next, let's move to another thing called encoding. In the dataset we are using in this course, which is called BACH, we have 4 classes where each class is a string. For example, let's assume these classes tall, medium, and short. And as you see in the equations, we are dealing with numerical values. So you cannot apply the categorical cross-entropy between a string and a numerical value. So you need to encode each category into a numeric value. There are 2 techniques. There is something called label encoding, which is considered a technique to convert categorical data into numerical format by assigning a unique integer to each category. And this method is straightforward and efficient for transforming them into a format suitable for machine learning algorithms such as CNN. And it's recommended to use label encoding for ordinal categorical variables, where there is a meaning order or ranking between categories. So we can assume the order here is important. So when we give a number or a value for each class, there is a meaning. When we increase the number, the person becomes shorter. Another technique is called one-hot encoding, and it's a technique used to convert categorical data into a numerical format that can be used by machine learning algorithms. And this approach is useful for handling the categorical variables, where each category is represented by a unique vector with all elements set to 0 except for that element corresponding to the category, which is set in that case to 1. So if you have 3 classes, red, green, and blue, we create a matrix and its shape or size is n by n, so 3 by 3 in that case because we have 3 classes. And because this is the first one, we will give the first index to p1 and other indices will be 0. This is the second, then for its record, the index of it will be 1 and others will be 0s. And this third one, so the third index will be 1 and others will be 0. And one-hot encoding ensures that there is no ordinal relationship is assumed between categories. Each category is treated as an independent entity. So if you see that value and that value, there is no relationship between them. So whether you use label encoding or one-hot encoding, both of them will work. In one-hot encoding, you need to define that the loss function is categorical cross-entropy, while in label encoding, you need to define it to be sparse categorical cross-entropy. This is a comparison between both of them. For one-hot encoding, you convert them to a new vector, and label encoding, you are converting to a numerical value. And this is an example for each. This is how to use the advantages, and the disadvantage of one-hot encoding is the high dimensionality, especially if you are dealing with 1000 classes, for example. And the disadvantage of label encoding, the model might assume false relationships because you are imposing an order on non-ordinal data. Now we have pre-processed the categories using label encoding or one-hot encoding. We defined the corresponding loss function. We understood the meaning of both of them. So now we need to train the model. The model, as mentioned, should be trained and validated in the training process. And then in the testing phase, it should be tested on unseen data. We have two approaches in the model evaluation. There is something called train test split and cross-validation. The train test split is a straightforward method to evaluate a model by splitting the dataset into two subsets, a training set and a testing set. The training set will be used in the training process, and the testing subset will be used to evaluate the model's performance and generalization. The common ratios for that split include 80:20 or 70:30, and both numbers means if you are using 80:20, you are splitting the dataset into 80% of it to be training and 20% of it to be testing, and the same for 70:30, 70 for training and 30 for testing. As mentioned, this approach is straightforward and valued for its simplicity and speed. You are just shuffling and splitting. However, the performance metrics obtained from a single split may be highly dependent on that particular split of data, and it may lead to variability in the results. This variability can be mitigated by performing multiple splits and averaging all of these results. But this still might not fully utilize the dataset efficiently, especially for smaller datasets. While in larger or medium datasets, we can perform a split, train the model, and get the results. Then we perform another split by shuffling the data again, train the model and get the results, and do that for multiple times, and then average all of the results so we get an average accuracy for that model, for example. However, in smaller datasets, we can use another approach called cross-validation. Cross-validation offers a more robust approach to evaluate the model by using multiple train test splits to ensure a model comprehensive assessment of the model. There are many approaches, but the most commonly used one is called k-fold cross-validation. In it, we simply split the dataset into folds for example 5 folds, so we are splitting the dataset into 5 groups. The model is trained and evaluated on k-1 fold and tested on just 1 fold, and this is repeated k times. By doing that, we are ensuring that every data point is used for both training and testing, providing a more reliable estimate of the model's performance. And the advantage of it is that we are reducing the variance in the performance, which can offer a more stable and unbiased evaluation. So cross-validation can mitigate the risk of performance metrics being skewed by a particular split of the data. However, it's more computationally intensive than a simple train-test split because it requires training and evaluating the model multiple times. For example, if you are going to apply 100-fold cross-validation, then we are repeating the training and testing 100 times. So it will take more resources and time. So to compare between them visually, in train-test split, we have the full data. We are splitting it into training and testing. And for the training portion, we are splitting it further for training and validation. So now we have 3 groups: training, validation, and testing. The upper 2 will be used in the training process, while the second one will be used in the testing process. And the train-test split approach is commonly used with medium and large datasets. On the other side, the cross-validation, we have the whole data. We split it into training and testing. In the training, we are splitting it further to folds. For example, here 5 folds. So we are splitting the data into 5 groups. In the first split or the training, we will take 4 folds for training and 1 for validation. So these are for training, this is for validation. And for the second split, we will take the first and the last 3 of them for training and the second for testing, and so on until we reach that the last one for evaluation and the first 4 splits, 4 folds for training. After completing, we are averaging all of the performance metrics, and then we test the trained model on the testing data. And this approach is commonly used with smaller datasets. So let's combine all of that in our code. We have imported different modules and functions, and as we mentioned, the star here means we are importing all of the modules and the functions inside that module. And as we recommended that we need a GPU device to train the model, to use parallel processing of that GPU to be faster in finalizing the training process. So that line will print the number of the GPU devices on your device or PC. Then here we created a function that encapsulates the model we created in the previous code, but here we defined 4 classes instead of 3, because in the PSH we are dealing with 4 classes: normal, benign, carcinoma in situ, and carcinoma invasive. Then we compiled the model with the different performance metrics, and we are using here categorical cross-entropy, and this means we are converting the actual outputs, which is Y, to one-hot encoding. While if we used sparse categorical cross-entropy, we are dealing with only label encoding, and we are then returning the model. And if we mentioned in the parameters to verbose, which means if we need to print anything, if this value is true, then we will show the summary of the model, which is the structure of it. But by default, we set it to 0, which is false. After that, we define the input shape for the input layer, and when we will call the function, we will provide the input shape to the function to be provided here. Then we define something called batch size and epochs, and we will understand the meaning of it after a bit. We define the classes, and then we read the data and performed pre-processing. Now we have 4 classes. Each one of them refers to a folder, where each folder contains a set of images. If this is our structure, then we can loop on each category, which reflects a specific folder. Then we will get the files in that folder. So these 4 categories are contained in that base folder. So here we are combining or joining the base path, which is that, to the category path. So if you put these folders in any other folder, you need to define the path of the folder in that variable. Then there is a function called list directory that gets all of the files in that path. After that, we made a random choice of a certain number of samples, because each folder, when you extract the batches, you will find it's imbalanced. So you'll find some classes can contain 1000, some classes can contain only 300, and so on. So for simplicity, we defined a variable here, samples per class, which is 300, and we made random choice of 300 without replacement to avoid getting the same image twice. And then we looped on each file and read the image. And to read the image, you need to define the path. So the full path of the function of the image will be the base path and the category path and the name of the file with the extension. After that, we resized it in case any image is not on the same size, to ensure that all of them are on the same size. The resize function needs only the width and the height. So we passed the first two elements of the input shape, which are 256 and 256. Then we appended the image in the X list, which is defined here by an empty list. Then we will need to append the category or the class, which is the variable here that takes its value from that list. So you can only append the value of the category path in the Y list, which is also initially set to an empty list. Now we have an X list and Y list. X contains the images and Y contains the names of the corresponding classes. Then we need to start pre-processing the data before applying it to the model to be trained. First step, we need to normalize the data. So instead of dealing with values from 0 to 255, we need to deal with normalized values to avoid collapsing the model during the training. Because in training the model, internally, there can be some functions which is powered and some functions which are cubed. So if you are going to power the value of 255, you will get a larger number. And imagine that you have 255 by 255 by 3 by 300 instances. You will get a very large number that may collapse your memory or the size of the variables. So for simplicity and avoiding that issue in training, you need to normalize the data. So divide it by the maximum number of the image, which is 255. After that, you need to convert these names or categories into one-hot encoding. There is a function called toCategorical, which is in the utilities module. That function takes numerical values and converts it to one-hot encoding. But you can say now these are not numerical values. So you need first to convert these values to numerical. So you will use label encoding. And the label encoding is available in the scikit-learn preprocessing module. So first, you create an encoder, fit transform the list of Y to be converted to numerical values, and then you take that variable to that function and convert it to ycat or to the one-hot encoding categories. And you can optionally define the number of classes here, which should be the length of that list, which is in that case 4. After that, to get ensure that you are working correctly, you can print the shapes and lengths of the variables. Now we have X and Y pre-processed and ready for the training. We will create the model by passing the input shape, the name of the optimizer, which is in our case Adam, and we define purpose by 1, so you will find the model summary printed to you. After that, we split the data. We have enough amount, so we use the approach of train test split. We split the X and Y cat, which are pre-processed, into training and testing. So X will be split into X train and X test, ycat will be split into ycat train, ycat test. The ratio will be 80 to 20, and we applied some randomization here, and then we define something called stratify. Stratify ensures and enforces that function that percentage is applied on each individual category. So for the stratify, you are defining here the classes, which should be the ycat. And to know the importance of that, let's assume that we have a category, which is a circle that consists of 6 instances, and another one, which is the x's with 3 instances only. If I told you to split this dataset randomly and take 6 instances for the training and 3 for the testing, or 2/3 for the training to 1/3 for the testing, by shuffling it without the usage of a stratify keyword or technique, you can say that the training set will be only the circle class, while the testing will be the X class. And in that case, there will be some sort of biasness, because the model will be trained on a class while will be tested on another class. So in stratify, you are ensuring that for each category, you are splitting with the same percentage. So for the first one, you are enforcing the model to take 2/3 for the training of the percentage of it. So you'll take 4 instances here and 2 instances here for the testing. And for the second category, 2/3 for training, so we'll take 2 instances here and 1 here. So now you are ensuring that the training and testing include samples from each category. So don't get rid of that keyword. After that, we need to train the model. The model is trained using the fit function. So model, or the variable here, .fit, and you need to pass some values here. First, you need to define the training dataset, which now consists of the X train and ycat train resulted from the splitting process. You need to define how many iterations, and in our case it's called epochs, to train the model, and we defined epochs by a variable here to 200. Then we define a batch size. The batch size here mean how many training samples or examples that are passed through the network or the CNN architecture in a single forward and backward passes. So if you define 32, or in our example 64, we are saying take 64 samples from the training and apply forward propagation and then back propagation, updating the weights, and do the same for the second one, for the third one, and so on until you finish all of the samples. And the batch size can be 1, and in that case will be called stochastic, because you will learn the model on each sample. So you'll take only one sample in the forward and the backward directions, and it can be also equal to the number of samples. So if we have only 1000 samples, we can define here batch size of 1000, and this case will be called batch learning. And if you take a mid value or an inner point between 1 and the number of samples or examples, will be called mini batch. And it's recommended to use mini batch and optimize that value to avoid any biasness or variance in the learning process or randomness. Then you need to define the validation split or the validation data. If you need to take a portion of the training data, you define here a percentage using the keyword validation split. And if you have a data for validation, you change the validation split to validation data, and you define here a table of the X and Y for validation. Then we can apply something called callback functions. The callback functions are executed after each epoch. So during the training process, you may need to apply a function or something between each epoch and another. The commonly used callback functions are the model checkpoint, and that callback will store the model on behalf of you if it performs better. So we are defining here save best only equals to true, and this means if the performance gets better, save the model. If not, ignore. And we are here monitoring the validation categorical accuracy. If you remember, we are defining categorical accuracy here and as a metric, and based on that you can get two values, one categorical accuracy for the training and another for validation. And what you define here is the name of the performance metric if you are targeting training, and prefixed by val underscore if you are targeting the validation. You may say that we have the C is capital, the A is capital without underscore here. Simply take any performance metric which is defined as a function and then convert it to the underscore case where all of them are in lowercase and split by underscores like what we see here. Save weights only, you can divide it by true if you need to save only the weights. If you don't and you need to save the model as a whole, you set it to false. After that, there is a callback called EarlyStopping, and this callback function means if the model performance is not getting better for the next 50 epochs, stop the model and stop the training process. And this will reduce the time consumption because you are assuming that if you waited until the remaining number of epochs, the performance will not be better. And you define here the patience epochs. 50 here means wait for 50 epochs until you decide there is no improved performance. But assume that after 25 the model performance is updated to be better, then it will recount again another 50. CSV logger, this one will store the performance metrics for the training and the validation during each epoch in a file, and you define the path of the file here. Reduce learning rate on plateau, you define here this callback function will reduce the learning rate after number of epochs if the performance is not getting better. So it should wait 10 epochs, and if this callback function decided to reduce the learning rate, aiming theoretically to improve the performance, the learning rate will be multiplied by that factor. So assuming that the learning rate is 1, for example, the new learning rate will be 0.5 and the next one will be 0.25 and so on. The TensorBoard callback function is a callback function used for visualization, and this tool is provided by TensorFlow that can visualize summary on the metrics, graphs on the training and validation, and the histogram of the weights. And you need to define here the histogram frequency, which is 1, and you can define any value. If you defined it to 0, then you will not store the histogram, while 1 will be stored each epoch and so on. Finally, you can define the verbose keyword. 1 means print on each forward and backward propagation. 2 means after training on the whole dataset for each epoch, and 0 means don't print any records on the terminal. In that case, the model will be trained and fitted, trained on the training subset and validated on the validation split or the validation data, and the model will be stored in that path using the callback function called ModelCheckpoint. So we need to load the best checkpoint if we need to apply external validation or testing. So we don't need to load the last one because it doesn't guarantee that the last one is the best. We need to load the best of all, which will be stored by that callback function. So we use model.loadWeights. We are loading the weights from the same path. Then we are printing the training and testing metrics by simply looping on the x and y for each tuple of them. We combined the training as a tuple, the testing as another tuple. Then we apply the function evaluate that takes x and y, and you can define here any batch size. And for simplest, you can define the batch size here similar to here. So now we can change the 16 to the variable batch size, and you can set verbose to 1 if you need to print the logging or the evaluation process, or 0 if you don't. The results will be stored in the variable and you can print them. The order of the performance metrics will be like that. The first index will be for the loss, while the others will be for the metrics as you defined in the metrics list here. So the second will be categorical accuracy, the third will be precision, and the last will be false negatives. Then we can plot the history of the training and validation and store the figure. How to reach the history of them? Simply, if you see here, the model.fit in the training and validation process returns a variable called history, and that variable will contain the history of the training and validation during each epoch. So in the history, you can access history loss, history validation loss, history categorical accuracy, and validation categorical accuracy. This and that for the training, and this and that for the validation. And you will see here, this is the training and testing, and you will see here the training and the validation curves for the loss and accuracy. Last, we are plotting something called the confusion matrix. The confusion matrix requires the true and predicted labels or categories. So we will use the predict function of the model variable and pass only the training x or the testing x, and define also the batch size. We can define similar to here the batch size variable, and similar to the verbose, it can be 0 or 1. It produces the labels in one hot encoding, and the confusion matrix requires them as numerical values 0, 1, 2, or any numerical value. So simply we can use the argmax function based on the rows to get the true and the predicted y variables, and the argmax here returns the argument of the maximum value. So simply if you return here and you need to convert that one using the argmax, so you can say for each row what is the maximum number, it's 1. So what is the maximum index of it is 0, so the value here will be 0. The second row will be 1, the third row will be 2. So this one hot encoding will be converted back to label encoding using the argmax. Then we calculated the confusion matrix using the confusion matrix function that can be loaded from the metrics in the scikit-learn library, and then we displayed that confusion matrix using the function called confusion matrix display. We define the confusion matrix and the labels to be written on the xy coordinates. Then we plotted the confusion matrix, and that function can be loaded also from the metrics module in the scikit-learn library. If you executed it, you will find also the confusion matrix as shown here. And to read that confusion matrix, you need to determine the axis for the true and the axis for the predicted. In our case, this is the true label, this is the predicted label. So we can read it like that. There is 32, which is actual benign and predicted also benign. And there is 13, which are benign but predicted to be carcinoma in situ. And there is 5 instances which are benign but predicted to be carcinoma invasive. And there are 10 instances that are benign but predicted to be normal. So what can we say about that number? 19. So we have 19 normal cases that are predicted to be benign. What about that? There is a case which is carcinoma in situ that is predicted to be normal, and so on. It worth noting also that if you looked at that number and that number for the accuracy, you will find that the training accuracy will be 0.81, while the testing accuracy is around 0.5. There is a big difference between them. And also, for the training and the validation accuracy curves, there is a gap between the training and validation. And this gap is called overfitting. When you find there is a big difference between the training and the validation, and the training is higher than validation, this is called overfitting. While if there is a gap but the validation is higher than training, this is called underfitting. And we are going to understand the meaning of overfitting and underfitting and overcome these issues using different techniques in the next lecture.